Why has France been so deeply involved in Africa, particularly in the Sahel? The answer lies in something former French President Jacques Chirac once admitted. Without Africa, France would struggle to maintain its economic standing. Today, that reality is unfolding as France faces massive financial setbacks after being expelled from Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. One of the biggest blows has been dealt to Air France, which has suffered a staggering €65 million loss after being barred from these three countries. For decades, the airline enjoyed a near monopoly over air travel in the region, generating massive profits. Flights to and from Mali brought in 500 million CFA francs daily, while Niger and Burkina Faso contributed 430 million and 390 million CFA francs respectively. In total, this amounted to over €2 million in daily revenue, just from one airline. But everything changed when military leaders took power in these nations. They made it clear that the days of France profiting from their resources while maintaining a stronghold on their economies were over. French troops were sent packing, major corporations were forced out, and the political influence that France had long enjoyed was swiftly dismantled. For Air France, this meant an immediate and painful financial hit, and for the broader French economy, it marked the beginning of a major reckoning. Desperate to regain access, France has been scrambling behind the scenes to negotiate a way back into the Sahel. However, the new governments in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger remain firm in their stance. There will be no return to the old system of exploitation. The leaders of these countries understand that France's global influence has long been propped up by wealth extracted from Africa. By cutting off these economic pipelines, they are forcing France to reckon with its declining power. This shift represents more than just financial losses for French corporations. It signals the unravelling of a system that had allowed France to dominate the region for decades. With the Sahel now asserting its independence, France is being forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Its economic survival is no longer guaranteed by its former colonies. For decades, France projected an image of industrial power and economic strength, but beneath the surface, much of its wealth came from resources it never actually owned. Despite lacking significant reserves of gold, uranium, and other critical minerals, France managed to position itself as a major exporter of these commodities. But the truth was simple: these resources weren't French, they were African. By controlling the mines and supply chains in its former colonies, France funneled vast amounts of wealth into its economy, while leaving African nations with only a fraction of the profits. Nowhere was this more evident than in gold mining. France has no major gold reserves, yet for years it exported massive amounts of the metal. The real source? West African nations like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where French companies dominated mining operations under exploitative contracts. The gold was extracted from African soil, refined in France, and then sold on international markets as a French commodity. This hidden dependency was publicly exposed when Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, called out France on live television, revealing how much of its so-called exports were actually resources stripped from African countries. But France's reliance on Africa didn't stop at gold. It extended to some of the most essential minerals of the modern world. Uranium, coltan, cobalt, and lithium are vital for producing batteries, electric vehicles, and advanced technology. France, lacking significant reserves of these minerals within its own borders, still managed to play a dominant role in the global high-tech industry. The reason? Its deep-rooted control over African mining sectors, particularly in the Sahel. But everything changed when Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali took matters into their own hands. Their rejection of French influence was not just about sovereignty, it was a direct challenge to the economic system that had kept them dependent on Paris for decades. A wave of military-led takeovers dismantled pro-French governments, signalling a shift that sent shockwaves through France's economic and political establishment. Paris responded with anger, imposing sanctions, cutting diplomatic ties, and attempting to isolate these nations on the international stage. But instead of submitting to pressure, the new leadership doubled down. French troops were expelled, embassies were shut down, and industries that had long been under French corporate control were seized and nationalised. In a matter of months, France lost its grip on the region, and with it, the vast resources that had quietly fueled its economy for years. Few things have hit France harder than the forced exits of Air France from the Sahel, a move that not only symbolised a loss of control, but also delivered a serious financial blow. For years, the airline was more than just a transportation service. It was an economic stronghold that allowed France to dominate African air travel, while ensuring that billions in revenue flowed straight back to Paris. With a near monopoly on flights between the Sahel and Europe, Air France controlled pricing, dictated routes, and kept fares artificially high, all while offering services that were far inferior to other international carriers. African nations saw little benefit, as profits were funneled back into French corporate hands, reinforcing economic dependence rather than fostering local growth. But everything changed when military-led governments in the Sahel took power. These new leaders began questioning why a foreign airline had such unchecked influence while offering so little in return. When Air France abruptly suspended flights in response to political shifts, they responded by permanently shutting the airline out and exploring alternative partnerships with other global carriers. Mali's Foreign Minister Abdoulaye Diop didn't hold back in his criticism, calling out Air France's exploitative business practices. He pointed out how the airline frequently cancelled flights at will, leaving African passengers stranded in Europe with no accountability. Such actions, he argued, would never be tolerated in the US or elsewhere in the West, yet Air France operated in Africa as if it had free rein. That era, he declared, was over. If Air France ever wanted to return, it would have to do so like any other airline, without privilege, without special treatment, and certainly without the dominance it once enjoyed. But why is Air France so desperate to return? The answer goes far beyond ticket sales. France's entire economic model in Africa relied on controlling key industries, from mining to transportation. The Sahel's decision to shut out French corporations is more than an inconvenience. It's a full-scale dismantling of the economic grip France has maintained for decades. Nowhere has this collapse been more devastating than in Niger, a country that played a vital role in keeping France's lights on, literally. For over half a century, Niger's uranium fueled France's nuclear power plants, providing over 70% of the country's electricity through French energy giant Orano, formerly known as Ariba. Before the coup in 2023, Niger supplied nearly 35% of France's uranium at dirt-cheap prices, with the country itself receiving only about 5% of the profits, while France reaped the rewards. When Niger's new government took power, one of its first major decisions was to halt uranium exports to France, accusing Orano of looting the country's resources while leaving its people in poverty. The consequences for France were immediate and severe. With its cheapest and most reliable source of uranium suddenly cut off, French nuclear plants were thrown into crisis mode, scrambling to secure alternative supplies from Canada and Kazakhstan at significantly higher costs. Orano's mining operations in Niger ground to a halt, leading to billions of euros in projected losses, while France faced an energy crisis that threatened both its economy and national security. Without Niger's uranium, France's nuclear power industry, once the backbone of its energy strategy, was left vulnerable, forcing the country to reckon with a future where its dominance over African resources was no longer guaranteed. Niger is making sure France never regains control over its uranium supply. By striking new deals with Russia and China, the country has ended France's decades-long monopoly over its most valuable resource. This shift marks a turning point, not just for Niger, but for the entire Sahel region. For years, France extracted gold, lithium, coltan, and other valuable minerals from West Africa, while giving little in return. These resources powered French industries, fueled technological advancements, and kept its economy running smoothly. But with the rise of new leadership in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, the days of foreign companies exploiting African wealth with minimal compensation are quickly coming to an end. Now, these countries are embracing a policy of resource nationalism, demanding fair deals that actually benefit their economies. French corporations, once deeply embedded in the region's mining sector, are being forced out as new governments prioritise partnerships with Russia, China, and other emerging powers. This has sent shockwaves through France's economy, as its once secure supply of African minerals is slipping away. One of the biggest industries feeling the heat is gold mining. Mali, the third largest gold producer in Africa, has expelled French-backed mining firms, replacing them with companies from Russia and China. Burkina Faso, which produces over 50 tons of gold every year, has imposed strict regulations that have made it nearly impossible for French firms to continue operating. Meanwhile, Niger has revoked multiple gold mining permits that were previously held by French companies, shutting off yet another revenue stream that once flowed directly to Paris. Beyond mining, France's energy sector is also taking a massive hit. Total Energies, one of France's biggest corporations, is now struggling as its once profitable operations in West Africa grind to a halt. With these three nations cutting economic ties, the company is losing access to vital oil and gas reserves that once gave France a steady and cheap energy supply. This sudden shift has sent ripples through the French economy, exposing just how dependent it was on African resources to maintain its global standing. If you are still watching this video, it means you love it. Why not take out a second and hit that like button? Have you done that? Let us move on. French corporations are reeling as their once dominant position in Africa crumbles. For years, they enjoyed exclusive access to the continent's wealth, operating with little oversight and raking in billions while African nations remained in economic limbo. But now that era is coming to an end, and the fallout is hitting some of France's biggest companies hard. One of the worst hit industries is gold mining. French-linked firms like Endeavour Mining, which had extensive operations in Mali and Burkina Faso, are now facing heavy restrictions and even the threat of nationalisation. These countries, determined to take back control of their resources, are no longer letting foreign corporations dictate the terms. Meanwhile, Bolloré Group, which once controlled the transport and logistics for these mining companies, is being rapidly pushed out. Chinese and Russian firms have stepped in, securing lucrative contracts that were once exclusively in French hands. This shift isn't just about minerals, it's also shaking up the oil and gas industry, where France's largest energy company, Total Energies, is struggling to hold on to its former strongholds. For decades, Total had a firm grip on oil production in Chad, Gabon and other parts of West Africa, supplying France with cheap energy while leaving African nations with minimal benefits. But now, as Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso cut economic ties with Paris, Total's operations are grinding to a halt. Niger, once a key supplier, has frozen oil exports to France, redirecting its energy trade toward China. Mali and Burkina Faso have followed suit, forging new deals with Russia and Middle Eastern nations, effectively sidelining French companies. Without the steady flow of African oil, France has been forced to turn to more expensive imports from the US and the Middle East, something it had long sought to avoid. But the crisis extends far beyond energy. Infrastructure projects, once dominated by French corporations, are now slipping from their grasp. For years, companies like Vinci, BEGS and Eiffage controlled the construction of major highways, railways, airports and power plants across West Africa. These contracts, often secured through corruption, ensured that billions in African taxpayer money flowed straight into French coffers. Instead of boosting local economies, these projects funneled wealth back to Paris, while African nations remained underdeveloped. That system is now being dismantled. The new leadership in Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger has stopped awarding contracts to French firms, instead bringing in companies from China, Turkey and Russia. Even local African businesses are now being prioritised, ensuring that investments actually benefit the continent instead of being siphoned off to foreign capitals. Perhaps the most dramatic collapse has been that of Bolloré Group. which once controlled Africa's largest network of ports, railways and shipping routes. With Sahel nations cutting ties with French logistics firms, France is losing billions in revenue from trade and transportation. This shift is a clear sign that the days of France dictating economic policy in its former colonies are over. The consequences for France are severe. Its economy, long propped up by cheap African resources, is now feeling the strain. Without uranium from Niger, gold from Mali, oil from Chad, and critical minerals from Burkina Faso, France is losing its competitive edge. Nuclear power costs are rising, trade influence in West Africa is fading, and once powerful corporations are facing an uncertain future. France is growing increasingly uneasy as the movement sweeping through the Sahel threatens to spread across the continent. The rejection of French influence in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso has sent shockwaves through other former colonies like Senegal, Chad, and Cameroon, where governments and citizens alike are beginning to question their long-standing economic dependence on Paris. At the same time, new global players are stepping in to offer an alternative. BRICS nations, led by China, Russia, India, Brazil and South Africa, are strengthening their presence across Africa, striking trade and development deals that challenge France's historical grip on the continent's wealth. Unlike the one-sided arrangements that benefited France for generations, these new partnerships are being framed as mutually beneficial, giving African nations more control over their own resources. If this trend continues, France could find itself completely shut out of Africa, severing the economic pipeline that has sustained it for over a century. But this isn't just about losing business contracts. It's the unravelling of an entire system built on extraction, control, and keeping Africa dependent. For decades, France took without giving back, ensuring that while African nations remained rich in resources, their people saw little benefit. Now the script has flipped, and France is struggling to cope with a reality where Africa is no longer willing to play by its rules. The warning signs were there long ago. Former French President Jacques Chirac once admitted that without Africa, France would be nothing. That statement is proving to be more accurate by the day. Yet while Africa is demonstrating that it can stand on its own, France is discovering that it cannot function without the resources it once took for granted. Desperate to maintain a foothold, France is now pushing for Air France to return to the Sahel. But this isn't just about reviving an airline. It's a strategic test. If France can force its way back in under the pretense of commercial air travel, it could set the stage for other French corporations to re-enter. And if businesses return, diplomatic influence could follow. From there, it wouldn't be long before France found a justification for deeper political and even military involvement, all under the guise of economic cooperation. Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso see through this ploy. Their leaders have made it clear that France will not be allowed to creep back in through the back door. The era of dominance is over, and they are determined to keep it that way. For years, the world was told that Africa needed France to survive. Now it's become evident that the opposite is true. The continent is forging its own path, demanding fair partnerships, respect and control over its own destiny. France, once the undisputed power in the region, is being forced to reckon with a new reality, one where Africa no longer plays the role of a silent, exploited partner, but an equal force shaping its own future. If you enjoyed this video and would love to watch more videos like this, be sure to hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.